Rain slashed across the empty station yard, driven sideways by a wind that moaned through warped planks and loose tin. The sky hung low, swollen and bruised, as if the whole heavens had been dragged to the edge of breaking. Water streamed down the steps of the depot, spilling into the churned mud where wagon ruts glistened like dark wounds. The air was cold enough to bite, each gust carrying grit and the sour tang of wet horse. She sat on the far bench beneath the sagging awning, small enough to look like a lost child. Her dress, once sky blue with neat white cuffs, was soaked through, clinging to the narrow lines of her frame. Strands of black hair stuck to her cheeks, dripping onto the bundle she cradled in her lap. She kept her eyes lowered to the boards, but her shoulders were tight, as if braced for a blow that had yet to land. From the freight office, laughter spilled into the storm. 3 men staggered into view, each with the slouch of a day spent drinking, and the mean alertness that comes when a quarry has been found. Their boots sloshed in puddles as they fanned toward her, words indistinct under the rain, but full of mocking invitation. One leaned on the rail post, leering. Another took a slow step closer, just enough to make her shrink into the corner. She did not look up. Her fingers tightened on the bundle until her knuckles went white. The freight door banged open again. He stepped out. Bare from the waist up, skin gleaming with rain, he carried a crate under one arm as if it weighed nothing. His hair, long and black as midnight water, hung slick down his back, a single leather cord binding it near the nape. Scars marked his shoulders and ribs, some pale with age, others raw from newer fights. The storm lit him in flashes, each revealing the breadth of him, the steadiness in the way he stood. He saw her first, then them. The crate dropped onto the covered platform with a thud that made the leering man glance over. Something passed between the giant Apache and the drunkards without words, a measuring, like wolves sizing one another before the bite. The wind howled through the gap, tossing rain into the space between them. One of the men grinned as if to show he wasn't afraid, and reached down to touch her arm. She flinched, not away but inward, drawing herself smaller. The Apache crossed the distance without hurry. His shadow fell over them before the man's fingers found purchase. He said nothing, just set his body between hers and theirs, eyes holding steady until the first man's grin faltered. "You've no right here," one muttered, but his voice lacked teeth. The Apache didn't answer. He only glanced at the second man's hand, resting too near the hilt of a knife, and the man's fingers twitched away as though scorched. The storm filled the silence, the hiss of rain on tin, and the low rumble of thunder beyond the ridges. He turned then, not to them but to her, and offered his hand. It was a rough, broad thing, palm-lined like weathered leather, knuckles nicked by work. She stared at it a moment, eyes darting to the men still watching, before she let her bundle slide into his grasp. When his fingers closed around it, they were careful, almost formal. Then he pulled her up from the bench with the same ease as lifting a child. The drunkards shifted back, muttering to each other, but they did not follow when he led her down the steps into the rain. Water soaked her hair anew, chilled her to the spine, but his stride was sure through the sucking mud. The horse hitched to the small freight wagon tossed its head as they approached, ears flat against the storm. He tossed her bundle onto the bench seat, then cupped his hands around her waist and lifted her up as if she weighed nothing at all. She shrank into the corner, arms around herself. He swung onto the seat beside her, his bare chest steaming faintly in the chill, and pulled a heavy wool blanket from the back. Without looking at her, he draped it over her shoulders, tucking the edges close so the wind couldn't tear it away. The reins snapped. The horse lunged forward, hooves sucking at the mire. The wagon creaked through the yard, past the station lamp swaying in the gale. Behind them, the men stood in a huddle under the awning, their shapes blurred by the rain until they vanished entirely. The road beyond town was a narrow ribbon of mud between stands of scrub cedar. Water ran down the ruts in quicksilver streams. The storm pressed in, making the world a small, sodden place. She sat rigid under the blanket, every jolt of the wagon seeming to jar her bones. He said nothing, eyes fixed ahead, but once, when the wind shifted, she caught the faint scent of smoke on his skin. They passed a broken fence where a calf stood bawling in the downpour. He slowed the wagon, leapt down, and guided the shivering animal back through the gap. She watched him work, calm, efficient, no wasted motion. then climb back to the bench without so much as brushing the rain from his face. The land began to rise, the rutted track giving way to rockier ground. Trees crowded closer, their limbs whipping in the wind. The blanket grew heavy with water, but it was still warmer than the storm's teeth. She dared a glance at him from beneath its edge. His jaw was set, his gaze steady as if the storm were only weather and not the weight of the world. A bolt of lightning split the sky, bathing the hills in white for a breathless moment. In that flash, she saw the narrowness of the trail ahead, the drop to one side where the river swelled dark and fast. The horse skidded, recovered. He murmured something low in Apache, the tone like a tether pulling the animal back to steadiness. Her teeth chattered, not entirely from cold. She pulled the blanket tighter, curling her toes in wet slippers. Somewhere ahead, the land flattened, the promise of shelter hidden in the black sweep of rain. When the first glow of lamplight appeared between the trees, she thought it a trick. Then the shape of a cabin emerged, a squat, sturdy form against the wind, smoke twisting from the stovepipe. He guided the wagon straight to its side, set the brake, and jumped down. She hesitated, clutching her bundle. He extended his arms without asking, and after the smallest pause, she let him lift her again. The heat of him, even soaked, was startling. He carried her to the door, shouldered it open, and stepped into a room smelling of wood smoke and pine. Inside, the light was dim, the air warmer, the storm muffled to a steady roar beyond the walls. He set her down by the stove, unwrapped the blanket, and hung it on a peg. She stayed where he placed her, water pooling at her feet, eyes following him as he moved to close the shutters. For the first time since the station, she breathed without tightness in her chest. But before the air could settle fully, a sharp knock rattled the door, a knock too soon for comfort, too heavy for a neighbor. The Apache's head turned toward it, eyes narrowing just a fraction. His hand found the rifle leaning by the wall. He looked at her once, measuring her fear, and in that look, she knew whatever was outside had not been left behind in the storm. The knock did not come again. Only the wind pressed against the shutters, and the rain hissed over the roof. He waited a moment longer, still as stone, before leaning the rifle back against the wall. Without a word, he crossed to the stove and pulled the kettle closer to the flames. The room smelled of iron and wet wool, smoke curling from the firebox each time he fed it another log. She stayed near the warmth, fingers loosening their grip on the bundle. Her hair clung damp to her neck, the ends dripping onto the rough plank floor. Steam rose faintly from her dress where it faced the fire. He set a dented tin mug before her and poured in hot water until it wavered near the rim. "Drink," he said, voice low, unhurried. She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her skin before tasting it. The water was plain but warmer than anything she'd held in days. She took it in small sips, feeling it settle deep, the knot in her chest easing with each swallow. He moved without fuss, hanging her soaked blanket near the stove and setting her bundle on the table as if it were something valuable. Outside, the storm battered the walls, but in here the lamplight spread in soft circles over the wood, catching in the curve of the tin plates, the worn grain of the table. She finished the water and set the mug down carefully, as if afraid to make a sound. He slid a small loaf of coarse bread toward her, followed by strips of dried meat. She hesitated, eyes flicking to his face, but he had already turned to the counter, working a knife against a block of salt pork. Hunger won. She ate slowly, biting the bread into neat pieces, each chewed until it was gone before she dared take another. He glanced over once, saw her rationing as if every crumb must last, and sliced the pork thicker. Without comment, he laid 2 pieces on her plate. The fire popped. Shadows shifted on the walls. She watched him move about the cabin, noting the deliberate quiet in the way he set things down, the space he left between them. He did not ask questions. Perhaps he didn't need to. When she had eaten all she could, she pushed the plate back an inch. He gathered the dishes, rinsed them in a basin with rainwater brought in earlier, and set them on a shelf above the counter. The rhythm of his work was steady, without waste. She pulled the blanket from the peg, now warm and nearly dry, and drew it around her shoulders. The smell of wood smoke clung to it. From her place by the stove, she watched him light another lamp and place it on a small shelf beside a narrow bed against the far wall. The quilt was faded but thick, patched in more than one place. He gestured toward it. "You sleep," he said simply. Her gaze flicked from the bed to him. There was only one. But he was already pulling a chair from the table, setting it near the stove. He dropped into it, boots still on, leaning back as if this had been his plan all along. The rifle rested within easy reach at his side. She stood for a moment longer, then crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. The quilt was cool under her hands. She lay down stiffly, keeping the blanket around her as well, eyes open to the low ceiling beams above. The fire's glow reached her in a soft pulse with each gust outside. Sleep came in fits, broken by the groan of the wind and the strange safety of the place. Once, she half woke to see him still in the chair, head tipped forward slightly, arms loose over his knees. The fire painted his profile in bronze and shadow. She shut her eyes again. By morning, the rain had thinned to a mist. Light spilled through the chinks in the shutters, warm against the walls. She sat up to find the chair empty. The door stood open to the yard, and beyond it came the sound of steel biting wood. She stepped to the threshold, quilt over her shoulders. The air was sharp, washed clean by the storm. He was by the chopping block, driving the axe through a round of pine, breath clouding in the cool air. Each swing was measured, the blade biting deep, the wood splitting clean. A small pile of cut logs lay at his feet, ready for stacking. He glanced up once, meeting her eyes across the space. No greeting, just a brief acknowledgement before he set another round upright. She lingered a moment longer, then turned back inside. On the table lay a tin plate with bread and a small pot of honey, its surface catching the morning light. She ate standing, the sweet sharpness of the honey strange and welcome on her tongue. The cabin smelled faintly of it now, mixing with the smoke from the stove. He came in not long after, boots damp, arms full of wood. The door banged shut behind him, muting the wind. He stacked the logs beside the stove, then pulled a kettle from the shelf and filled it from the rain barrel outside. His movements were efficient, practiced. Her eyes caught on the marks along his forearms, old burns, a thin scar that curved over the muscle. She looked away before he could notice. When the water was set to heat, he leaned his rifle against the wall near the door. She realized it had been within reach of him all night, even in sleep. "I'll sweep," she said suddenly, her voice rough from disuse. He glanced at her, then at the broom in the corner. A slow nod. She took it up and began in the far corner, working toward the door. Dust and pine needles whispered over the boards. He watched only long enough to see that she knew what she was doing, then turned back to the kettle. As she worked, she found herself humming under her breath, an old tune from home, soft enough that the sound barely carried. She stopped when she realized, but the faint curve at the edge of his mouth told her he had heard. The day moved in small, quiet tasks. He mended a split in the corral rail while she cleaned the small shelf by the bed, folding the spare quilt neatly. They spoke little, the air between them filled instead with the scrape of tools, the creak of wood, the low hiss of the stove. By late afternoon, a thin sun broke through the clouds, lighting the wet yard in silver. She stood at the doorway, quilt still over her shoulders, and saw the land stretch out beyond the pines, muddy track leading down toward the river, the ridge beyond rising dark and steady against the pale sky. Something in her eased at the sight, though the unease in her chest had not gone. She could feel it still, a knot under the ribs. Safety here was a fragile thing, perhaps only borrowed. Behind her, his voice came low. "Storm's not done." She turned to find him setting the rifle on the table, a small pouch of cartridges beside it. His eyes lifted to hers, steady. "They'll come again." The quilt felt suddenly thin, no warmer than the breath she drew in. She knew he meant the men from the station. The memory of their voices, their eyes, rose sharp as the wind outside. He reached for the rifle, checked the chamber, and set it back down. "You'll be ready." Her hands tightened on the quilt's edge. She wasn't sure if he meant to teach her, to hide her, or to send her away. But in his gaze there was no sign of leaving her unguarded. Outside, the last beam of sunlight slipped behind the ridge, and the cabin sank into shadow. Somewhere far off, a single hoofbeat echoed against the wet ground before fading into the trees. Morning came with a pale, clean light spilling across the floorboards, the kind of light that made every scar and scratch on the wood stand out. She was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the bed, her bundle open before her. Inside were only a few folded garments, a comb, and a pair of hairpins shaped like cranes. She held one between her fingers, turning it so the silver caught the light, then set it back as though it might shatter. He was outside again, mending the corral. She could hear the rasp of his saw between the moments of quiet. She stepped into the doorway, quilt still around her shoulders, and watched him fit a new rail into place. His movements had the surety of someone who had built and rebuilt his world with his own hands. She found herself speaking before she meant to. "Is it far?" "To California." He didn't look up. "Far enough." A pause then. "Not for you." "Not now." Her eyes drifted down the slope, to the mud-brown river curling through the lowland. "I thought, maybe if I could get there, I'd be safe." The word tasted unfamiliar. He set the saw down and came toward her, wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped just inside the yard, close enough she could see the droplets of river water still clinging to his hair. "From what?" Her lips pressed together. She wanted to say nothing, to keep it behind the wall she'd built since stepping off the ship. But the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet cedar and earth, and she found herself answering in fragments. "They said I would so. That I would work for my keep. They gave me bread, a bed. Then, the man with the cards came. Took me from the house, said I owed him for the passage." His eyes didn't move from hers. She tried to smile, to make it sound less than it was. "He called me a lucky charm for his table. But I was bad luck," he said. She broke off, looking away toward the treeline. "I ran when the fight started. Walked until I saw the station." The wind carried silence between them. He didn't ask for more, didn't touch her. He only nodded once, a slow acknowledgement, as though he'd already known some part of it. Later, while she swept the floor, a shadow crossed the doorway. The knock that followed was quick, sharp. She froze, bristles catching on a loose board. He was there in 2 steps, opening the door to a man with a hat pulled low and a rain-spotted coat. "Storm's done for now," the neighbor said. "But you ought to know, gamblers' men been nosing around, asking about a little Chinese girl in a blue dress." Her breath caught. The broom's handle felt slick in her grip. The neighbor's eyes slid to her and back again. "He's not one to quit when something's in his teeth." The Apache's voice was even. "I hear you." When the door shut, he locked it, then crossed to the table where the rifle lay. He pulled a whetstone from the shelf and began to sharpen his knife in slow, measured strokes. The rasp of steel on stone filled the cabin. She stood there, still clutching the broom. "They'll come here." "Maybe." She moved to the table, untying her bundle. From it she drew one of the silver hairpins, the crane. It was the only thing of value she had left. She held it out to him with both hands. "Take it. For helping me." His eyes dropped to the hairpin, then back to her face. He didn't touch it. "Keep." Her throat tightened. She returned it to the bundle, folding the cloth around it. The knife's steady rhythm against the stone went on. That night, she dreamed of footsteps in rain, of the smell of whiskey, and the scrape of cards on a table. She woke in darkness, the fire low, the chair by the stove occupied by his still frame. His head was tipped back against the wall, but she could tell by the set of his mouth that he wasn't asleep. In the morning, a rider passed along the trail below the ridge. The hoofbeats carried in the cold air, fading and returning as the path wound between trees. She stepped to the window, lifting the corner of the curtain just enough to see. The horse was a bay she didn't recognize. The rider didn't look up, but the way his head turned as he passed made her step back quickly. He came in from the yard soon after, shutting the door firmly behind him. "Stranger," he said. She nodded, though he hadn't asked. The day wore on with a tautness under the skin of every moment. She mended the edge of the quilt, her fingers working the needle while her ears followed each sound outside. The groan of the wind, the drip of melting water from the eaves, the occasional creak of the corral gate. He split more wood, checked the tack on the horse, set extra water inside in case the barrel froze again. By afternoon, clouds had thickened over the ridge, a darker belly to the sky. The wind came in low whistles through the cedar stand. She found herself glancing toward the rifle each time the door opened. While he worked the latch on the shutter, she asked, "Why help me?" His shoulders rose and fell. "Because you were alone." It was not the answer she expected, and for a long moment, she didn't know what to say. Finally, she asked, "And if they come?" He looked at her then, eyes steady as stone. "We don't give you back." The words should have comforted her, but they brought a tremor instead, because they made it real. Whatever was between her and the gambler was not finished. She finished the quilt's hem just as the light began to thin. He took it from her hands, shook it once to settle the folds, and laid it across the bed. The gesture was wordless thanks, but the weight of it stayed with her as she moved to the stove. She ladled out a thin stew, the scent of onions and dried meat filling the cabin. They ate in quiet, the wind pressing against the walls in slow breaths. Outside, the sky dropped lower, color draining into the kind of gray that meant another storm was riding in. After the bowls were rinsed and set aside, he checked the rifle again, sliding the bolt back with a practiced hand. The sound was sharp in the small space. She watched, arms wrapped in the blanket, and thought of the knock that had started all of this. When the first drops began to patter against the roof, she rose and moved to the door, peering out into the dark yard. The shapes of the corral and the chopping block were only shadows now. Somewhere beyond them, the ridge loomed. He came to stand beside her, the rifle in his hand. The storm's edge swept in with a rush, bending the trees. She could smell the wet earth rising already. "You'll want to keep that bundle close," he said. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "You think they'll use the storm?" "They might." Thunder cracked in the distance, rolling over the hills. The horse in the corral shifted, tossing its head. She looked at him, and for the first time saw not just the man who had pulled her from the bench, but someone measuring the space between trouble and home, already deciding where to stand when the line came. A gust slammed against the door, rattling it in the frame. He set the rifle against the wall long enough to drop the bar into place. The lamplight flickered, caught in the dark sheen of his hair. "They'll test the door first," he said, almost to himself. She swallowed, the taste of the stew gone from her mouth. Somewhere inside, the crane hairpin lay folded in cloth, a small piece of silver in a world of steel and rain. Outside, the hoofbeats came again, this time closer, slow through the mud, circling rather than passing. The storm arrived like a living thing, howling down the ridge, tearing at the trees, flinging rain in sheets that blurred the world to a handful of shifting shapes. The lamp inside guttered under each gust. She sat near the stove with the blanket clutched to her, watching him stand at the window, his outline sharp in the flicker of light. The rifle rested in his hands, ready but low. Hoofbeats emerged from the storm's roar, slow and deliberate. 3 riders took form in the yard, their shapes bending and breaking in the curtain of rain. Shadows under their hats, shoulders hunched against the downpour, they looked like they had ridden out of the dark itself. The lead horse shifted, pawing the mud. Its rider raised a hand. "We're looking for a girl," he called, his voice carrying over the wind. "Chinese. Young. Came through the station yesterday." Her breath caught, and the blanket tightened around her. He didn't answer, didn't move. "Gambler says she's his," another man added, a sharper tone behind the words. "Says she ran off with what wasn't hers." The Apache stepped away from the window, opened the door, and walked out into the storm. Bare-chested despite the cold, his skin shone wet under the flashes of lightning. Rain ran down the lines of his shoulders and along the scars that told stories without words. The men straightened in their saddles at his approach, though one's hand drifted toward his belt. "She's not yours to take," he said, his voice low but cutting through the storm's din. The lead rider laughed, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That for you to decide?" "That's for me," he answered. A pause, measured, dangerous. Then one of the riders swung down from his horse, boots sinking into the mud. "I'll take a look inside, just to be sure." The Apache's hand didn't move toward the rifle slung at his shoulder. Instead, he stepped forward until the man had to stop or walk into him. They stood a breath apart, the rain falling hard enough to sting. "You'll turn back," he said. The man smirked, and his hand flicked toward his revolver. The rifle came off the Apache's shoulder in a single motion, barrel lifting. A crack split the storm, and the man's hat spun into the mud, a clean hole burned through the crown. The shot left a ringing in her ears even from inside. The man stumbled back, cursing. One of the horses shied, splashing muck up its rider's leg. The second rider tried to circle wide, pushing his horse toward the cabin's flank. She had been watching from the shadows and moved before she thought, snatching the kettle from the stove, steam curling from its spout, and darting to the door. As the rider passed close, she threw the boiling water hard. It caught his arm and shoulder, and his shout was swallowed by the wind. The horse jerked sideways, nearly unseating him. Lightning split the sky again, and in its light, a fourth figure appeared beyond the yard. The gambler. His coat was soaked through, brim dripping, but his face carried that same smirk she remembered, smug and certain. "Well," he drawled, voice raised over the storm. "You've made yourself busy, friend. But you've got something that belongs to me." "She's not yours," the Apache said. "She's a debt," the gambler replied, guiding his horse forward until its hooves splashed in the yard's deepest puddle. "And debts get paid. Out here, that's the law." The Apache's gaze didn't shift. "Not tonight." The gambler's smile thinned. "You think standing bare in the rain makes you something? You think she's yours just because you pulled her from a bench?" He leaned forward in the saddle. "You give her over now, I let this be the end of it." The Apache stepped to the wagon, where it stood hitched and ready by the fence. He reached up, pulled her from the doorway, and lifted her into the seat. She clutched the blanket around her, heart pounding. Then he turned back to the gambler. "She is my wife." The words hit harder than the rain. She froze, breath caught, eyes darting to his profile. He didn't look at her. His gaze was on the men, the declaration as much a shield as the rifle. The gambler's eyes narrowed, flicking from one face to the other. "You married her?" "In front of whoever asks," he said. The men shifted uneasily. Even in this place, even in the mud and storm, marriage was a line not crossed lightly. To take a man's wife was to invite the kind of blood that didn't wash away. The gambler's smirk returned, but it was tighter now, the edge of calculation in it. "You think I care about your paper vows?" The Apache lifted the rifle again, slow and deliberate, until the barrel pointed at the gambler's chest. "Try me." For a long moment, the storm was the only sound. Wind in the trees, rain hammering the roof, the distant crack of thunder over the ridge. Then the gambler spat into the mud and jerked his chin to his men. "This isn't done," he said. The riders wheeled their horses, the churn of hooves sending water splashing high. They melted back into the curtain of rain, shapes breaking apart and vanishing down the trail. He lowered the rifle, watching until the sound of hooves was gone. Only then did he step to the wagon and help her down, his hand warm even through the storm's chill. She stood on the ground, staring up at him, the blanket heavy around her shoulders. "You didn't have to say that," she murmured. "Yes," he said, meeting her gaze at last. "I did." They went inside without another word, shutting the storm out behind them. The lamplight seemed brighter now, though the shadows still clung at the edges. She stood by the stove, heart still racing, while he set the rifle back against the wall and poured water into the kettle once more. In the silence, she realized her hands had stopped shaking. But outside, somewhere beyond the ridge, the gambler was still out there, and his promise had not been an idle one. The wind pressed against the cabin again, harder this time, rattling the shutters as if to remind them both that the night wasn't over. Dawn came slowly, as though the storm had wrung every drop of color from the world. The air was damp and sharp, heavy with the smell of cedar and churned earth. She woke to find him already outside, the door left open just enough for the chill to creep in. Through that narrow space, she could see him in the yard, sleeves rolled to his elbows now, hammer in hand as he mended the corral gate the storm had half torn away. His movements were steady, deliberate, like someone who had been working with the same tools and the same patience all his life. She rose from the bed and wrapped herself in the quilt, bare feet silent against the worn boards. The kettle still sat on the stove, water gone cold in it. She poured some into a cup and sipped, the faint metallic tang settling on her tongue. Outside, the wind stirred the damp grass, and the wagon tracks from last night's confrontation still cut deep into the mud. He noticed her watching and paused just long enough to nod before setting the hammer aside. When he came in, his hair was damp with the morning mist, and his eyes held that unshakable calm she had seen even when rifles were raised. "They'll come again?" she asked quietly. "Not today." He crossed to the stove, striking a match to relight the fire. "He'll wait. Men like him always wait until they think you've stopped watching." Her fingers tightened on the cup. "And if you hadn't said—" She stopped, the rest caught between gratitude and fear. He looked up. "They'd have taken you." She set the cup down, the metal clinking softly against the table. "You don't even know me." His eyes didn't leave hers. "I know enough." The fire caught, wood snapping in the grate. He poured what remained of the water into the kettle, and set it over the flame. The cabin warmed slowly, the air softening, carrying the scent of pine pitch and wet wool from the blankets drying near the stove. She found herself breathing easier, though the knot in her chest hadn't fully loosened. The hours passed in quiet work. He took the wagon down to the lower field to check the fence line, returning with a sack of grain and the smell of open air clinging to him. She swept the floor, mended the frayed hem of her dress, and laid the quilt neatly across the bed. There was a comfort in these tasks, the kind that came from knowing exactly where one's hands belonged. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had begun to thin, light spilling in slow patches over the ridge. He came in from the yard with a length of clean rope coiled over one arm. "We'll go to town tomorrow," he said. She hesitated. "To town?" He set the rope aside. "There's a preacher. A quiet man." Her breath caught. She searched his face for some trace of jest, but found only the same steady certainty that had carried through the storm. "You mean to?" "I mean to finish what I said." His voice was even, but there was something under it, an unspoken promise, perhaps, or a line he had already decided to cross. She looked down at her hands, fingers resting on the edge of the table. "You don't have to keep saying it just because. I don't say things I don't mean." The weight of that hung between them, more solid than the table or the walls. Outside, the last of the wind sighed through the trees. The next morning, the road into town was still damp, the wheels of the wagon leaving dark tracks in the packed earth. She sat beside him on the bench, her bundle tucked at her feet. He wore his best shirt, white against the bronze of his skin, and had tied his hair back with a strip of leather. She had washed her dress as well as she could, the faded blue brightened by the sunlight. The town was quiet when they arrived, the air carrying the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, and the faint tang of horse from the livery. A few faces turned toward them as they passed, some curious, some calculating. She kept her eyes ahead, fixed on the small wooden church at the end of the main street. Inside, the preacher was as he had described, a quiet man with kind eyes, who asked no more than was necessary. They stood together at the front, the words simple, the vows spoken low. His hand was warm when it closed over hers, steady as it had been on the day he'd lifted her from that bench. When it was done, she felt something shift inside her, not a sudden lightness, but the slow, certain settling of a weight that had been held too long. Outside, the sunlight caught in her hair, and for the first time in many weeks, her shoulders were not drawn in. They returned to the station where they had first met, the bench still damp from last night's rain. He paused there, looking at it for a long moment. "You were smaller then," he said. "I was trying to be," she answered. He turned to her, and there was the faintest ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "You don't have to any more." The road home was quiet, the only sound the creak of the wagon and the calls of distant birds. She let the wind catch her hair, eyes on the ridge ahead. The sky was clear now, but she knew storms would come again. Out here they always did. Yet the thought no longer tightened her chest the way it once had. That night, the cabin was warmer than it had ever felt. She moved easily in the small space, setting bread on the table while he poured water into the cups. The firelight caught on the silver crane hairpin she had tucked into her hair. When she caught him noticing, she touched it lightly. "I kept it," she said. He nodded once. Good. After the meal, he stepped outside. She followed, the air cool on her skin. The yard stretched quiet under the stars, the corral gate mended, the fence line whole again. He leaned on the fence, looking toward the dark line of the ridge. They'll hear soon enough, he said. She came to stand beside him. About us. About what's theirs and what's not. She thought of the gambler's face, of the way his eyes had narrowed when he'd heard the word wife. And when he comes? He looked down at her, the lamplight from the cabin catching in his eyes. We'll be ready. The words held no bluster, only truth. She believed them. In the days that followed, she learned the rhythm of the place, the way the light fell through the pines in the morning, the creak of the well rope, the sound of his boots on the porch at dusk. She began to hum again while she worked, soft tunes that filled the air between them. He never interrupted, only listened. One evening, as the last light bled out of the sky, she stood in the doorway and watched him walk back from the lower field. The silhouette was familiar now, broad shoulders, steady gait, the easy balance of someone who belonged to the land. When he reached the porch, he set a small bundle in her hands. Inside was a piece of carved bone, shaped into a ring. It's not gold, he said. But it's mine to give. Her fingers curled around it, the smooth surface warm from his palm. Then I'll keep it. She slipped it onto her finger, and for a moment, the world was only the two of them under the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond the ridge, storms would gather again. Riders might return, debts might be claimed, and the wind would howl hard enough to shake the shutters. But standing there, the ring on her hand and his presence solid beside her, she understood what he had meant. Storms might come, but there were some you faced together, and together, they broke differently. She turned toward him, and he met her gaze, the corner of his mouth lifting in that small, rare smile. Now, the narrator's voice would have said if this were a tale told by the fire. Click the story waiting on your screen, one fiercer than this, where the wind cuts colder and the nights run longer. You'll feel it in your bones. I'll be there to tell it.